Sarah Martinez had always believed that moving to the quiet suburb of Millbrook would give her and her 8-year-old son Tommy the peaceful life they deserved. After years of military service that took her to some of the world's most dangerous places, she craved nothing more than ordinary moments, school pickup lines, grocery shopping, and bedtime stories. The small town seemed perfect, with its tree-lined streets, friendly neighbors, and the kind of safety that let children ride their bikes until streetlights came on. On that Tuesday morning in October, Sarah was running late for Tommy's soccer practice. She had spent the previous evening helping him with a science project about ocean currents, drawing on her extensive knowledge of maritime operations without revealing too much about how she had acquired such detailed understanding of tidal patterns and underwater navigation. Tommy knew his mother had served in the Navy, but Sarah had kept the specifics of her role deliberately vague. To him, she was simply Mom, the woman who made the best pancakes, could fix any broken toy, and somehow always knew when he was trying to sneak extra cookies before dinner. As they hurried toward the local park where practice was held, Tommy chattered excitedly about the upcoming game against their rival team. Sarah listened with half an ear while scanning their surroundings with the subtle awareness that had been drilled into her during years of training. Old habits died hard, and even in peaceful Millbrook, she found herself noting escape routes, potential threats, and environmental factors that most people never considered. The park was busier than usual that morning. Parents clustered in small groups along the sidelines, discussing everything from school fundraisers to weekend plans. Sarah recognized most of the faces by now. She had been part of this community for 6 months, long enough to establish routines but not quite long enough to form deep friendships. She preferred it that way. Close relationships meant questions, and questions led to conversations she wasn't ready to have. Tommy ran off to join his teammates, his cleats clicking against the pavement as he called out greetings to friends. Sarah settled onto the metal bleachers with her coffee, watching as Coach Williams began setting up orange cones for drills. The morning sun cast long shadows across the field, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves. For a moment, Sarah allowed herself to relax completely, letting her guard down in a way she rarely permitted. That's when she noticed them. 3 men stood near the parking lot, their posture and positioning immediately catching her attention. They weren't parents, she knew all the parents by sight. They weren't joggers or dog walkers, the usual morning traffic through the park. Something about their body language, the way they seemed to be watching rather than participating in the peaceful morning scene, triggered the alarm bells that years of training had embedded deep in her psyche. Sarah's breathing remained steady, but her awareness sharpened. She noted their approximate ages, mid to late 30s, their clothing, and the way they kept glancing toward the children on the field. One of them, a tall man with graying temples and expensive sneakers, seemed to be the leader. He gestured subtly to his companions, and they began moving closer to the practice area. Parents continued their conversations, oblivious to the subtle shift in dynamics. Coach Williams blew his whistle, calling the children into a circle for warm-up exercises. Tommy waved at his mother from across the field, his gap-toothed grin bright in the morning sun. Sarah waved back, her smile automatic even as her mind processed potential scenarios and responses. The 3 men were now standing behind the bleachers, close enough that Sarah could hear fragments of their conversation. They spoke in low tones, using language that made her stomach tighten with a familiar mixture of anger and protective instinct. They were discussing the children, rating them, making comments that no decent person would voice about 8 and 9-year-olds. Sarah's military training had taught her to distinguish between idle talk and genuine threats. These men weren't just passing through or making inappropriate jokes. Their focus was too intense, their positioning too deliberate. They had come here with a purpose, and that purpose involved the children on the field. She stood slowly, stretching as if working out a crick in her back, using the movement to get a better view of the men while appearing casual. The leader was holding what looked like a small camera or phone, angling it toward the field. His companions flanked him, creating a barrier between their activities and the other parents. Sarah's phone was in her hand instantly, but she hesitated before dialing 911. She needed more information, clearer evidence of intent. In her experience, law enforcement was more effective when presented with concrete evidence rather than gut feelings, no matter how well trained those instincts might be. Moving with practiced nonchalance, she walked toward the concession stand, a route that would take her closer to the men without appearing purposeful. As she passed behind them, she heard enough to confirm her worst fears. They weren't just watching randomly, they had been here before, had identified specific children, and were planning something that made Sarah's blood run cold. The leader noticed her proximity and turned slightly, his eyes meeting hers with a calculating look that she recognized from dozens of dangerous encounters in her past life. He was assessing her, determining if she posed a threat to their operation. What he saw was a petite woman in yoga pants and a faded navy sweatshirt, someone who looked like every other suburban mother in the park. Sarah maintained eye contact for just a moment, long enough to let him know she was aware of him, but not long enough to appear confrontational. Then, she continued toward the concession stand, her mind racing through options and protocols. She could call the police, but response time in Millbrook was typically 15 to 20 minutes for non-emergency calls. She could alert the coach, but that might spook the men into leaving before authorities arrived, only to return another day when she wouldn't be there to notice. Behind her, she heard the distinct sound of a camera shutter, followed by low laughter that made her skin crawl. They were taking pictures now, documenting the children for purposes that Sarah refused to let herself imagine in detail. As she purchased a bottle of water she didn't want from the teenage volunteer at the concession stand, Sarah made her decision. These men had chosen the wrong park, the wrong children, and definitely the wrong day to pursue their twisted agenda. They thought they were dealing with ordinary suburban parents who would be too shocked or frightened to act decisively. They had no idea that among the yoga pants-wearing, coffee-drinking mothers scattered around the bleachers was a woman who had spent 6 years as part of the Navy's most elite fighting force. A woman who had conducted covert operations in hostile territories, who had been trained to think 3 moves ahead of her enemies, and who had sworn an oath to protect the innocent that didn't end when she hung up her uniform. Sarah returned to her seat on the bleachers, every sense heightened, every muscle ready. She watched Tommy run drills with his teammates, his innocent laughter mixing with that of his friends, and felt the familiar calm that always preceded action settle over her like a second skin. The 3 men were growing bolder, moving closer to the field, their cameras more obvious. Other parents were beginning to notice, whispers spreading through the small crowd as people realized something wasn't right. Sarah could see the exact moment when collective unease would tip into panic, and she knew she had to act before that happened. She stood again, this time with purpose, and began walking directly toward the men. Her stride was confident but not aggressive, her expression neutral but alert. Years of training had taught her that the key to successful confrontation was controlling the narrative from the first moment of contact. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard by nearby parents but not so loud as to cause alarm. "I don't think we've met. Are you here for the soccer practice?" The leader turned fully toward her now, his companions shifting to flank him in a formation that Sarah recognized as defensive positioning. They thought they were dealing with a curious mother who could be easily intimidated or dismissed. "Just enjoying the morning," the man replied, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Beautiful day for watching kids play, don't you think?" The way he emphasized watching kids sent ice through Sarah's veins, but she maintained her pleasant suburban mother expression. "It really is. Which one is yours?" The question hung in the air between them, and Sarah saw the moment when the man realized she knew exactly why they were there. His smile faded, replaced by something much uglier, and his companions moved closer. "I think you should mind your own business, lady," one of them said, his voice carrying a threatening undertone that made several nearby parents look over in concern. Sarah nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his suggestion. "You know, that's interesting advice. I've always been told that when it comes to children's safety, it's everyone's business." The tension in the air was becoming palpable now. Other parents were definitely paying attention, some pulling out their phones, others moving protectively closer to the field where their children continued their practice, unaware of the drama unfolding behind them. "Tommy," Sarah called out, her voice bright and normal. "Come here for a minute, sweetheart." Her son looked up from where he was practicing penalty kicks, saw her waving, and jogged over with the easy confidence of a child who had never learned to fear strangers. As he approached, Sarah positioned herself between him and the 3 men, her body language shifting in ways that only someone with extensive combat training would recognize. "What's up, Mom?" Tommy asked, slightly out of breath from running. I just wanted to make sure you had your water bottle, Sarah replied, her eyes never leaving the men. And, to remind you about stranger danger. Remember what we talked about? How important it is to tell a grown-up if anyone ever makes you feel uncomfortable or asks you to do something that doesn't feel right? Tommy nodded seriously, picking up on the underlying tension even if he didn't understand its source. Yes, ma'am. Should I go back to practice now? In just a minute. Sarah's voice remained calm and motherly, but there was steel underneath that made the lead man take a step backward. I want you to listen very carefully. If I tell you to run, you run straight to Coach Williams and tell him to call 911. Can you do that for me? Now Tommy looked genuinely worried, his eyes darting between his mother and the strangers behind her. Mom, is everything okay? Everything's fine, baby. I just want to make sure you know what to do, just in case. Now go back to practice, but stay close to Coach Williams, okay? Tommy nodded and ran back toward the field, but Sarah noticed he kept looking back over his shoulder. Other parents were beginning to converge on their location, drawn by the obvious tension and the protective instincts that came with being responsible for children's safety. The three men were trapped now, surrounded by increasingly suspicious parents in a public place where their activities had been noticed and questioned. The smart thing would have been to leave immediately, to retreat and try again another day in a different location. Unfortunately for everyone involved, these men weren't particularly smart. You need to back off, bitch, the leader snarled, his mask of civility finally dropping completely. You have no idea who you're messing with. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something in her stance shifted, a subtle alteration that spoke of coiled violence held in careful check. Actually, she said quietly, I think you're the ones who have no idea who you're messing with. That's when the first man made the mistake of reaching toward her, his intention clearly hostile. And that's when Sarah Martinez, former Navy SEAL, loving mother, and protector of the innocent, decided that her peaceful suburban morning was officially over. The moment the leader's hand moved toward Sarah, muscle memory took over. Years of intensive training compressed into split-second reactions as she sidestepped his reach with fluid precision, simultaneously grabbing his wrist and using his own momentum to send him stumbling forward. The move looked almost casual to the watching parents, as if she had simply stepped aside to avoid an overly aggressive handshake gone wrong. But the man felt the iron grip on his wrist, the pressure point manipulation that sent shooting pain up his arm, and the effortless way she controlled his movement. His eyes widened with the sudden realization that he had seriously misjudged the situation. Whoa there, Sarah said loudly enough for the growing crowd of parents to hear, her tone remaining conversational despite the violence brewing beneath the surface. Let's keep this friendly, shall we? There are children present. The other two men moved to flank her, a tactical error that Sarah had anticipated. They thought they were dealing with a frightened suburban mother who had gotten lucky with one defensive move. They had no conception of what they were actually facing. Sarah's awareness expanded to encompass the entire environment. Tommy was safely with his coach, who had noticed the commotion and was keeping the children away from the growing confrontation. Other parents were pulling out phones, some calling 911, others recording video. The positioning of every person, every potential weapon, every escape route was catalogued and filed in the part of her mind that never stopped calculating tactical advantages. Look, lady, the second man said, trying to sound reasonable while moving closer, you're making a big mistake here. Just walk away and everyone stays happy. Sarah released the leader's wrist but remained in position to counter any aggressive moves. I think there's been a misunderstanding, she replied, her voice carrying just far enough to ensure the other parents could hear every word. See, you gentlemen seem to think you can come to a children's soccer practice and take inappropriate pictures without anyone objecting. But, here's the thing about parents, we tend to get a little protective when strangers start photographing our kids. The accusation hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Several parents gasped, and Sarah heard someone behind her say, "Oh my God, that's why they were acting so weird." The crowd dynamic shifted palpably as protective anger began to replace confused concern. The leader rubbed his wrist, his face flushed with embarrassment and rage. You don't know what you're talking about. We weren't doing anything wrong. Really? Sarah's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. Then, you won't mind if we all take a look at the photos on your phone, right? I'm sure they're just innocent pictures of the beautiful park scenery. The challenge was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. If the men refused, they essentially admitted guilt. If they agreed, the evidence would condemn them. If they tried to delete the photos, it would be obvious to everyone watching. Sarah had boxed them into a corner with nothing but words and the implicit threat of her presence. The third man, who had been silent until now, decided to try intimidation. He was bigger than his companions, with the kind of bulk that came from gym workouts rather than real physical conditioning. "Listen here, you little bitch," he growled, stepping directly into Sarah's personal space. "You need to shut your mouth and walk away before something bad happens to you." The threat was clear and unmistakable, delivered in front of a crowd of witnesses that now included several fathers who had arrived for pickup duty. The atmosphere crackled with tension as two very different types of predators faced off, those who targeted the helpless, and one who specialized in eliminating threats to the innocent. Sarah looked up at the man towering over her, seemingly unimpressed by his size advantage. "Something bad," she repeated thoughtfully. "Like what, exactly? Are you threatening me in front of my son and all these other parents?" "Maybe I am," he replied, reaching out to grab her arm. "Maybe you need to learn some respect." What happened next would be replayed on cell phone videos and discussed in the community for months to come. As the man's hand closed around Sarah's arm, she moved with explosive speed and precision that seemed to defy physics. Her free hand struck upward in a palm strike that caught him under the nose, snapping his head back while her leg swept his feet from under him. The combined movements sent all 220 pounds of him crashing to the ground in less than 2 seconds. The sound of his body hitting the pavement was audible across the park, causing the soccer practice to come to a complete halt as children and coach turned to see what had happened. Tommy started to run toward his mother, but Coach Williams caught his arm and held him back, recognizing that this was a situation where children needed to stay clear. "Stay down," Sarah commanded, her voice carrying an authority that made everyone in earshot freeze. The fallen man groaned and clutched his nose, blood seeping between his fingers, but he made no attempt to get up. Something in Sarah's tone conveyed that standing would be a very poor decision. The other two men stared in shock at their companion's rapid defeat, finally, beginning to understand that they were not dealing with an ordinary opponent. The leader's earlier bravado evaporated as he realized that the small woman who had seemed like an easy target was something else entirely. "Holy shit," someone whispered behind Sarah. "Did you see how fast she moved?" Sarah kept her attention focused on the remaining threats while speaking to the crowd. "Could someone please make sure 911 has been called? These men have been taking inappropriate photographs of children, and one of them just assaulted me." "Already done," called out a father from the growing crowd. "Police are on their way." The fallen man attempted to sit up, still holding his broken nose. Sarah's attention snapped to him with laser focus. "I said stay down. That wasn't a request." Something in her eyes convinced him that compliance was his safest option. He remained flat on his back, breathing heavily and occasionally groaning in pain. The leader tried one last attempt at controlling the narrative. "This is insane. She attacked us. We were just watching kids play soccer." With telephoto lenses and inappropriate commentary, Sarah replied calmly. "In case anyone missed it, this gentleman just admitted they were watching children. I think we can let the police sort out whether that constitutes normal park behavior." Parent after parent began speaking up, recounting fragments of conversation they had overheard, describing the men's suspicious behavior, confirming that they had been photographing the children. The crowd testimony built an overwhelming case against the three men, eliminating any possibility of claiming innocence. The second man, apparently deciding that discretion was the better part of valor, began backing toward the parking lot. "This is crazy," he muttered. "We're leaving." "Actually, you're not." Sarah's voice cut through his retreat like a blade. "You're going to stay right here until the police arrive. All of you." "You can't make us stay," he protested, continuing his backward movement. Sarah's smile was thin and utterly lacking in warmth. "Would you like to test that theory?" Because I have to tell you, your friend there thought he could make me do things I didn't want to do, and it didn't work out very well for him. The man on the ground groaned agreement with this assessment, and the second man stopped his retreat. The mathematical reality was inescapable. If she could handle their largest companion that easily, the rest of them had no chance in individual confrontation. "What are you, some kind of cop?" the leader demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "Something like that," Sarah replied, which was technically true. Navy SEALs operated in a law enforcement capacity in many of their missions, though their jurisdiction was considerably broader than local police. The sound of sirens in the distance brought visible relief to the gathered parents and obvious despair to the three men. Sarah felt some of the tension leave her shoulders as she realized that the immediate threat was contained and professional help was incoming. Tommy broke free from Coach Williams and ran to his mother, throwing his arms around her waist. "Mom, are you okay? That man was bleeding." Sarah hugged her son close, her protective instincts shifting from tactical awareness to maternal comfort. "I'm fine, baby." These men were acting inappropriately around children, and sometimes grown-ups have to stand up to people who don't behave properly. "Did you hurt him badly?" Tommy asked, his 8-year-old mind trying to process the violence he had witnessed. "He hurt himself by trying to hurt me," Sarah explained carefully. "Remember what we always talk about? How it's never okay for someone bigger to pick on someone smaller. And how sometimes we have to defend ourselves when people try to hurt us." Tommy nodded solemnly, looking up at his mother with a mixture of concern and awe. "You were really fast, Mom. Where did you learn to do that?" "The Navy taught me some things about taking care of myself," Sarah replied, which was another technically accurate statement that glossed over the specifics of her specialized training. The police cars arrived with lights flashing, and Sarah felt the familiar mixture of relief and apprehension that came with the arrival of law enforcement. In her experience, police officers varied widely in their competence and understanding of complex situations. Some would immediately grasp the dynamics of what had occurred, others might focus more on the violence they witnessed than the threat that had prompted it. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez was the first officer to reach the scene, and Sarah felt grateful when she recognized his competent demeanor and professional approach. She had met him briefly at a community safety meeting several weeks earlier and had been impressed by his thorough understanding of local concerns. "What do we have here?" Sergeant Rodriguez asked, taking in the scene with practiced eyes. He noted the man on the ground, the crowd of agitated parents, the positioning that suggested recent confrontation, and the woman at the center of it all who stood with the relaxed alertness of someone trained to handle crisis situations. Multiple parents began speaking at once, eager to provide their version of events, but Rodriguez raised his hand for silence. "One at a time, please." "Ma'am," he addressed Sarah directly, "you appear to be at the center of this situation. Could you give me your account of what happened?" Sarah provided a clear, chronological account of the morning's events, from her initial observations of the men's suspicious behavior through the escalating confrontation and physical altercation. Her report was precise, factual, and delivered with the kind of clarity that came from years of professional debriefings. Rodriguez listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes, his expression growing increasingly serious as the scope of the situation became clear. When Sarah finished her account, he turned to the other parents for corroboration. The consistency of the witness testimony was overwhelming. Person after person confirmed Sarah's description of events, adding their own observations about the men's inappropriate behavior and threatening language. Several parents had recorded portions of the confrontation on their phones, providing video evidence of the men's admissions and aggressive actions. The man on the ground was examined by paramedics who had arrived with the police, his broken nose documented and treated while he was placed under arrest. His companions were cuffed and searched, their phones confiscated as evidence pending a warrant to examine their contents. "Mrs. Martinez," Sergeant Rodriguez said, approaching Sarah as the scene began to wind down, "that was some impressive defensive work. Where did you learn those techniques?" "Military training," Sarah replied simply. "Old habits." Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "Navy, right? I saw the sweatshirt. What was your rating?" Sarah hesitated for just a moment. She had known this question would come eventually, had prepared for it, but actually answering still felt like crossing a line she had drawn for herself. "Special operations," she said finally. "I'd prefer not to get into specifics." "Understood," Rodriguez replied, and Sarah could see in his eyes that he grasped the implications of her careful phrasing. "Between you and me, these guys picked the wrong park and definitely the wrong woman to mess with." As the police vehicles pulled away with their prisoners and the crowd of parents began to disperse, Sarah found herself surrounded by grateful neighbors who had witnessed her actions. The mood was celebratory, filled with relief that a potential tragedy had been averted and admiration for the decisive way she had handled the threat. But, as the adrenaline began to fade and the reality of what had just occurred settled over her, Sarah realized that her carefully constructed new life had just undergone a fundamental change. The quiet anonymity she had worked so hard to maintain was gone, replaced by community recognition and questions she wasn't sure she was ready to answer. Tommy looked up at her with eyes full of questions and newfound respect, and Sarah knew that the conversation she had been dreading, the one where she explained exactly what Mommy used to do in the Navy, could no longer be postponed. The morning that had started with soccer practice and ordinary parental concerns had ended with her past and present colliding in the most public way possible. As she packed up their gear and prepared to head home, Sarah wondered if peaceful suburban anonymity had been an impossible dream from the beginning. Some battles, she reflected, had a way of finding you no matter how far you tried to run from them. The drive home from the park was unusually quiet, with Tommy stealing glances at his mother from the passenger seat every few seconds. Sarah could feel the weight of his unasked questions filling the small space of their Honda CR-V, and she knew that the conversation she had been avoiding for 6 months could no longer be postponed. "Mom?" Tommy finally ventured as they pulled into their driveway. "Those men at the park, they were really bad, weren't they?" Sarah turned off the engine and sat still for a moment, gathering her thoughts. Through the windshield, she could see their modest 2-story home with its white picket fence and carefully tended garden, the picture of suburban normalcy she had worked so hard to create. It felt suddenly fragile, like a stage set that could be dismantled at any moment. "Yes, sweetheart," she said finally. "They were planning to hurt children. That's why I had to stop them." "But how did you know what to do? And how did you move so fast?" Tommy's 8-year-old mind was struggling to reconcile the mother who made him peanut butter sandwiches with the woman who had incapacitated a man twice her size in under 2 seconds. Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt and turned to face her son fully. "Do you remember how I told you that I served in the Navy before you were born? And that sometimes I can't talk about all the things I did?" Tommy nodded solemnly. He had always accepted that his mother's military service included secrets, the way other kids accepted that their parents' jobs had boring details they wouldn't understand. "Well, I wasn't just a regular sailor. I was part of a very special group of people who were trained to protect others and stop bad guys from doing terrible things." Sarah paused, searching for age-appropriate words to explain concepts that most adults couldn't fully comprehend. "Think of it like being a superhero, except real and without the costume." "Like Captain America?" Tommy asked, his eyes wide with fascination rather than fear. Sarah smiled despite the gravity of the situation. "Something like that, yes. But the important thing is that even though I don't do that job anymore, I still remember how to protect people I care about. Especially you." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments while Tommy processed this information. Sarah could practically see the wheels turning in his young mind as he rearranged his understanding of who his mother really was. "Are there more bad guys who might come after us?" he asked finally, demonstrating the kind of tactical thinking that made Sarah both proud and worried. "I don't think so, baby. Those men were just bullies who picked on people they thought couldn't fight back. Now that they know they were wrong, and now that they're in jail, they won't be bothering anyone anymore." But even as she said the words, Sarah felt a nagging unease. In her experience, predators like the ones she had encountered rarely operated alone. They were part of networks, connected to other criminals who shared their twisted interests. The 3 men at the park had been too organized, too confident to be random opportunists. That evening, after Tommy had gone to bed with his head full of adventure stories about his mother's mysterious past, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open, conducting the kind of research she had hoped never to need again. Using skills and contacts from her former life, she began tracing the identities of the 3 men who had threatened her son's school community. What she found made her blood run cold. The leader, Marcus Webb, had a criminal record stretching back 15 years, with arrests for child endangerment, possession of illegal materials, and suspected involvement in trafficking cases that had never gone to trial. His associates, brothers named Kevin and Dale Morrison, had similar histories and were known associates of a larger criminal organization that operated throughout the region. More troubling still were the connections she uncovered between Webb's group and a network of individuals who had been tracking her movements for the past several months. Her carefully constructed new identity hadn't been as secure as she had believed. Someone had been watching, waiting for the right moment to approach her or her son. Sarah's military training kicked into high gear as she realized the full scope of what they were facing. This wasn't a random encounter with opportunistic predators. This was a targeted operation, and she and Tommy were at the center of it. Her phone rang just after midnight, causing her to jump despite years of training that should have prepared her for unexpected contact. The caller ID showed an unknown number, but the voice that answered her cautious hello was achingly familiar.
Sarah? It's Mike Chen.
Commander Mike Chen had been Sarah's commanding officer during her final deployment, and hearing his voice brought back a flood of memories from a life she had tried to leave behind. They had served together through some of the most dangerous missions imaginable, and his presence on the other end of the line meant that her past had officially caught up with her present. "Mike," she said, keeping her voice low so as not to wake Tommy.
"This is unexpected.
I heard about what happened at the park today. Word travels fast in certain circles, especially when it involves former members of our community."
Sarah's mind raced as she processed the implications.
If Mike had already heard about the incident, it meant that other people had as well, people who understood exactly what Sarah's defensive capabilities meant about her true background. "I'm assuming this isn't a social call," she said.
"Unfortunately, no. Sarah, those men you encountered today?
They're connected to something much larger than a local child predator ring. We've been tracking their organization for months as part of a joint task force operation." Sarah felt her carefully constructed normal life crumbling around her.
"What kind of operation?"
"The kind that involves national security and people who would be very interested in getting their hands on someone with your particular skill set and knowledge base."
The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity.
The men at the park hadn't been random predators who had stumbled across her and Tommy. They had been sent to identify, locate, and possibly capture a former Navy SEAL whose specialized knowledge made her a valuable target for the wrong kind of people. They were using the children as bait, Sarah realized aloud. Create a situation where I would have to respond, confirm my identity and capabilities, then use that information to plan a more serious approach.
That's our assessment as well.
Sarah, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You and Tommy are in immediate danger, and we need to bring you both in for protection until we can neutralize the threat.
Sarah's maternal instincts warred with her military training.
Every fiber of her being screamed that she should grab Tommy and run, disappear into the kind of deep cover that her specialized training made possible. But she also knew that running would only provide temporary safety. These people had found her once, they could find her again. "What are my options?" she asked, falling back on the professional mindset that had kept her alive through countless dangerous situations.
Option 1, you and Tommy disappear into federal protection.
New identities, new location, complete break from your current life.
And option 2?
You help us take down the network.
Use yourself as bait to draw them out so we can roll up the entire operation.
Sarah closed her eyes, knowing that there was really no choice at all. She couldn't run from this threat, it would follow her and Tommy wherever they went, making them perpetual victims. And she couldn't live with the knowledge that other families were at risk while she hid in safety.
If I agree to option 2, what protections do you have in place for Tommy? Complete security detail, safe house location, the best protection we can provide. Sarah, you know I wouldn't ask this of you if there were any other way.
She did know that. Mike Chen had been a mentor and, father figure during her military service, someone who had always put his people's welfare above mission objectives. If he was asking for her help, it meant the situation was desperate enough to justify putting a former operator and her child at risk.
How long do I have to decide? Unfortunately, you don't. We have intelligence suggesting that they're planning to move against you within the next 48 hours. The incident at the park accelerated their timeline.
Sarah looked around her quiet kitchen, taking in the homework papers scattered on the counter, the soccer schedule stuck to the refrigerator with alphabet magnets, the crayon drawing Tommy had made of their family that she had framed and hung near the window. All the small details of the normal life she had built were about to be swept away by the violent world she had tried to leave behind. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, because in the end, that was the only question that mattered.
Pack light. Bring only essentials for you and Tommy. A team will pick you up in 3 hours. Mike, if something happens to me, if this operation goes wrong, nothing will happen to Tommy. I give you my word on that, Sarah. We'll protect him no matter what. After she hung up the phone, Sarah sat in the darkness of her kitchen and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to grieve for the life she was losing. She thought about the friends she would have to abandon without explanation, the routine that had given both her and Tommy such comfort, the beautiful illusion of safety she had maintained for 6 precious months. Then, she wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and went upstairs to wake her son with news that would change his life forever. Tommy took the news with the resilience that had always amazed her. Yes, he was scared. Yes, he had questions. But, he also understood, with the clarity that children sometimes possessed, that his mother was someone special who had enemies that required them to be very careful. As they packed their few essential belongings in the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We know who you are now. We know what you can do. But, we also know your weakness." Attached was a photo of Tommy at soccer practice, taken with a telephoto lens from a position that would have been invisible to Sarah's surveillance of the park. Sarah deleted the message and finished packing with renewed determination. These people had made a critical error in judgment. They thought that threatening her child would make her vulnerable, would compromise her effectiveness as an opponent. They were about to learn that threatening Tommy Martinez didn't make his mother weak. It made her absolutely lethal. The safe house was located in a rural area 40 miles outside the city, hidden among rolling hills and dense woods that provided natural cover from surveillance. Sarah had been in dozens of similar facilities during her military career, but never as a protected asset with her child depending on the security measures she was usually responsible for implementing. Tommy adapted to their new temporary reality with the flexibility of childhood, treating their situation like an extended camping trip with very serious grown-ups standing guard. The federal agents assigned to their protection were professional and competent, but Sarah could see in their eyes the same question that had followed her throughout her military career: how could someone so small be so dangerous? Commander Chin arrived on their 3rd day in protection, bringing with him detailed intelligence about the criminal network they were facing. The briefing took place in the safe house's main room while Tommy napped upstairs, exhausted from a morning of exploring the woods under the watchful eyes of their security detail. "The organization calls itself the Collective," Chen began, spreading photographs and documents across the coffee table. "It's a loose network of criminals who specialize in acquiring high-value targets for various purposes: trafficking, ransom, intelligence gathering, assassination." Sarah studied the photographs, recognizing several faces from her military service. These were the kinds of people who operated in the shadows of international conflict, profiting from chaos and human suffering. "Their interest in you goes beyond your SEAL background," Chen continued. 3 years ago, you were part of Operation Silent Thunder, the mission that disrupted their weapons trafficking operation in Eastern Europe. You personally eliminated their main operational coordinator and recovered intelligence that led to the arrest of dozens of their associates. The memories came flooding back: a rainy night in Bosnia, a convoy of trucks carrying weapons to terrorist organizations, the split-second decision that had saved civilian lives while dismantling a major criminal enterprise. Sarah had done her job and moved on to the next mission, never considering that her actions might create long-term personal consequences. "So this is revenge," she said. "Partly. But it's also practical.
They want to know what you learned during that operation, what intelligence you might still possess that could threaten their current activities. And they want to demonstrate that no one can cross the collective without consequences. Agent Lisa Rodriguez, the federal task force leader, leaned forward in her chair. The plan is relatively straightforward. We've leaked information suggesting that you're being moved to a new safe house tomorrow evening. The route will take you through a remote stretch of highway where they're likely to make their move.
And, when they do?
You'll be ready for them, Chen replied. Along with a full tactical support team positioned to provide backup while maintaining the illusion that you're vulnerable. Sarah looked at the satellite photos of the ambush location, her trained eye immediately identifying the tactical advantages and vulnerabilities of the terrain. It was good ground for an ambush, with multiple escape routes and natural cover positions. It was also good ground for a counter-ambush, if you knew what you were doing and had the right support.
What about Tommy? He stays here with full protection until this is over, Agent Rodriguez assured her.
Nothing happens to him regardless of how the operation unfolds. That evening, Sarah sat on the front porch of the safe house with her son, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Tommy was reading a book about dinosaurs, occasionally sharing interesting facts about velociraptors and triceratops while Sarah listened with half her attention and used the other half to plan for the next day's operation.
Mom? Tommy looked up from his book. Are you going to be okay tomorrow?
Sarah was constantly amazed by her son's ability to understand situations that adults tried to hide from him. I'm going to be very careful, she promised. And I'm going to have lots of help from other good guys.
Will the bad guys try to hurt you? They might try. But, remember what we talked about? About how I learned special things in the Navy that help me protect people? Tommy nodded seriously.
Well, tomorrow I'm going to use those special things to make sure these bad guys can never hurt our family or anyone else's family ever again.
Like a real superhero mission?
Sarah smiled and pulled him closer.
Exactly like that. The next morning brought final preparations and equipment checks.
Sarah found herself slipping back into the familiar rhythm of pre-mission protocols, weapons inspection, communication systems testing, review of tactical plans and contingencies. It felt strange to be doing these things while wearing civilian clothes in a peaceful rural setting, but the muscle memory was as strong as ever. Agent Rodriguez provided her with a concealed radio system and backup weapon to supplement the sidearm she had been carrying since leaving Millbrook. The support team will be in position by 1400 hours, she explained.
Vehicle tracking shows the collective's assets moving into the area as of this morning. How many are we expecting? Minimum of 6, possibly as many as 12. They're not taking any chances with you.
Sarah appreciated the professional respect implied in the enemy's overwhelming force allocation. It meant they understood exactly who they were dealing with, which would make them careful and methodical rather than reckless and unpredictable. The hardest part was saying goodbye to Tommy, who was trying very hard to be brave despite his obvious worry. Sarah knelt down to his eye level and took his hands in hers.
I want you to remember something, okay? No matter what happens today, no matter what anyone tells you, I love you more than anything in the whole world. You are the most important thing in my life, and everything I do is to keep you safe.
Tommy threw his arms around her neck and held on tight.
I love you too, Mom. Please come back.
I will, Sarah promised, hoping that it was a promise she could keep. The drive to the ambush site took 2 hours, with Sarah sitting in the back of an unmarked sedan while trying to look like a nervous protected witness rather than a former special operations soldier preparing for combat. The route took them through increasingly remote countryside, past farms and forests that provided excellent concealment for hostile surveillance.
Movement on the ridgeline, her driver reported quietly into his radio. Multiple vehicles taking position.
Sarah felt the familiar calm settling over her as combat became inevitable. This was what she had been trained for, what she excelled at, what she had been avoiding for the past 2 years of civilian life. The fear and uncertainty that had plagued her since leaving the military evaporated, replaced by crystal clear focus and absolute confidence in her abilities.
Contact in 60 seconds, the driver announced.
The first vehicle appeared around a bend in the road ahead of them, blocking their path with precision timing that spoke of careful planning and professional execution. Sarah's driver began the scripted evasive maneuver that would position their vehicle exactly where the support team needed it to be. Taking fire, the driver shouted as gunshots erupted from the tree line. This was Sarah's cue. She rolled out of the moving vehicle as it skidded to a controlled stop, taking cover behind the engine block while return fire from the hidden support team began to suppress the enemy positions. The collective had walked directly into a carefully prepared trap, but they were professional enough to adapt quickly to the changing tactical situation. Sarah moved with lethal efficiency, using her intimate knowledge of small unit tactics to identify and eliminate the enemy positions one by one. The skills that had made her one of the Navy's most effective special operators returned as if she had never stopped training, muscle memory and tactical instinct combining to turn her into a force of nature. The firefight lasted exactly 14 minutes. When the shooting stopped, 8 members of the collective were dead and 3 others were wounded and in custody. Sarah had sustained a minor graze on her left arm and a bruised rib from diving behind cover, injuries that barely registered against the adrenaline coursing through her system. All targets neutralized, she reported into her radio. Area secure. Agent Rodriguez's voice crackled back immediately. Outstanding work. Medical and cleanup teams are en route. As Sarah sat on a fallen log waiting for the post-operation procedures to begin, she felt something she hadn't experienced in over 2 years, the deep satisfaction that came from using her skills to protect innocent people. The suburban mother persona she had constructed was real and important, but it was only part of who she was. She was also a warrior, and warriors protected those who couldn't protect themselves. The drive back to the safe house seemed to take forever, but, finally, Sarah was climbing the front porch steps where Tommy waited with barely contained excitement. He launched himself into her arms with enough force to knock a smaller person over, chattering questions about the mission while she held him close and breathed in the scent of his shampoo. "Did you get the bad guys?" he asked. "We got them, baby. All of them. They won't be hurting anyone ever again. Are we safe now? Can we go home?" Sarah looked around at the peaceful rural setting, then at the federal agents who were already discussing relocation procedures and new identity protocols. Home to Millbrook was probably impossible now. Too many people knew who she really was, and the kind of enemy she had made didn't give up easily. But, as she held her son and felt the deep contentment that came from successfully completing a mission that mattered, Sarah realized that home had never really been a place anyway. Home was this 8-year-old boy who thought his mother was a superhero, who had inherited her courage and resilience, who would grow up knowing that sometimes good people had to fight to protect those they loved. "We'll find a new home," she told Tommy. "Somewhere safe where we can be ourselves without having to hide who we really are. Will you teach me how to be like you when I grow up?" Sarah smiled as she carried her son into the safe house, thinking about the conversation they would need to have about responsibility and service and the price of being someone who stood between innocent people and those who would harm them. "If that's what you really want," she said. "But first, you have to finish 2nd grade and learn your multiplication tables." Tommy giggled and squeezed her tighter, and Sarah knew that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together. She was a mother and a warrior, and both parts of her identity were essential to protecting the people she loved. The woman who had once been Sarah Martinez, suburban soccer mom, was gone forever. But the woman who remained, someone stronger and more complete than either of her previous identities had been alone, was ready for whatever came next. Some battles ended with victory parades and medals. Others ended with a mother carrying her son upstairs for bed after the most important mission of her life. Sarah knew which kind of victory mattered more.